I want you to imagine a trade war so catastrophically mismanaged that it forced American companies to buy materials from the very countries they were supposed to be pressuring. That's exactly what happened with aluminum tariffs, and the consequences exposed how little policymakers understood about modern manufacturing. I've been analyzing trade policy for decades, and I can tell you that the aluminum tariff disaster represents something worse than simple policy failure. It represents the complete triumph of political theater over economic reality, executed with such perfect incompetence that it achieved the exact opposite of every stated goal. When protection becomes starvation, when tariffs designed to help American industry instead destroy it, you're witnessing policy failure on a scale that defies rational explanation. The official story, as it was sold to the American people, sounded perfectly reasonable to anyone who didn't understand how modern manufacturing actually works. Aluminum is essential to American industry. Foreign competitors were dumping cheap aluminum, undermining American producers. Tariffs would protect American aluminum companies, create American jobs, and rebuild American industrial capacity. It was economic nationalism 101, and it made perfect sense until it collided with reality. The reality was that American aluminum consumption vastly exceeded American aluminum production, and had for decades. When you impose tariffs that make foreign aluminum prohibitively expensive, but domestic production can't fill the gap, you don't get industrial revival, you get industrial starvation. American manufacturers suddenly found themselves unable to get the materials they needed to operate, not because of foreign competition, but because of American policy. Let me walk you through exactly how this policy disaster unfolded, because the mechanics reveal everything about how disconnected policymakers had become from the industries they claimed to be protecting. When aluminum tariffs took effect, American companies that depended on aluminum for their operations faced an immediate choice: pay dramatically higher prices for foreign aluminum or find domestic sources that could meet their needs. The problem was that domestic sources didn't exist in sufficient quantities to meet American industrial demand. American aluminum production had been declining for years, not because of unfair foreign competition, but because aluminum smelting is an extremely energy-intensive process that requires massive capital investment and cheap electricity. Market forces had already determined that much aluminum production was more efficient elsewhere, and tariffs couldn't magically resurrect capacity that had been economically unviable for decades. What happened next should have been predictable to anyone who understood industrial supply chains. Companies didn't just absorb higher aluminum costs and continue operating. They ran out of materials. Production lines shut down. Orders couldn't be filled. Workers got sent home. The very industries that aluminum tariffs were supposed to protect began collapsing because they couldn't get aluminum. The automotive sector felt it first and most severely. Car manufacturing requires enormous quantities of aluminum for everything from engines to body panels. When aluminum became scarce and prohibitively expensive, automakers faced a choice between stopping production and relocating operations to countries where aluminum remained available. Many chose relocation, not because they wanted to abandon American workers, but because American policy had made American production impossible. The construction industry followed closely behind. Aluminum is embedded throughout modern construction, from window frames to electrical systems to structural components. When aluminum prices spiked and supplies became uncertain, construction projects got delayed, canceled, or moved to jurisdictions where materials could be sourced reliably. American construction workers found themselves competing for fewer projects because American policy had made their industry uncompetitive. The packaging industry experienced perhaps the most ironic version of this crisis. Aluminum cans and containers are fundamental to American food and beverage distribution. When aluminum shortages threatened packaging operations, companies faced the prospect of being unable to package products for American consumers because American tariffs had made packaging materials unavailable. The policy designed to protect American industry was literally threatening American food distribution. As the crisis deepened, something remarkable happened that perfectly captured the contradictory nature of the entire policy. American manufacturers began applying for tariff exemptions so they could buy foreign aluminum. They were literally begging the government for permission to purchase materials from the very countries that the tariffs were supposed to pressure. The policy had become so counterproductive that compliance meant business failure. The exemption process itself became a bureaucratic nightmare that exposed how little policymakers understood about the industries they were regulating. Companies had to prove that domestic aluminum wasn't available in sufficient quantities or appropriate specifications, which was obviously true but required extensive documentation and lengthy approval processes. Meanwhile, production schedules collapsed and workers went unpaid, while bureaucrats decided whether American companies could buy the materials they needed to operate. Canada emerged as the inadvertent beneficiary of this American policy disaster. Canadian aluminum producers who had maintained stable production capacity and predictable pricing suddenly found themselves in extraordinary demand not just from Canadian manufacturers, but from desperate American companies seeking reliable supplies. Canada hadn't competed aggressively for this market position. American policy had created it. Canadian officials understood the opportunity and responded accordingly. Instead of exploiting American desperation through price gouging, they maintained stable pricing and reliable delivery schedules. This approach built long-term relationships with American manufacturers who discovered that Canadian suppliers were more dependable than American policy. Once those relationships were established, they proved extremely difficult for American competitors to break. The broader economic implications of the aluminum crisis extended far beyond any single industry or company. When basic industrial materials become unreliable or unaffordable, it affects everything downstream. Higher aluminum costs meant higher prices for cars, appliances, construction, and packaging. American consumers paid more for everything that contained aluminum, which is virtually everything in modern life. Meanwhile, American aluminum producers, who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of protection, found themselves in an impossible position. Tariffs had indeed reduced foreign competition, but they had also destroyed much of the domestic demand for aluminum. When manufacturing companies can't afford your product or relocate to escape your pricing, protection becomes meaningless. You can't sell aluminum to companies that have stopped making aluminum-intensive products. What makes this crisis particularly tragic is how completely avoidable it was. The fundamental problems with aluminum tariffs were obvious to anyone who understood industrial supply chains. Industry associations warned about shortages. Trade economists predicted exactly the disruptions that occurred. Manufacturing companies explained how integrated global aluminum markets actually function. But policy was made based on political messaging rather than economic analysis. The human cost of this policy disaster was enormous, but largely invisible to the policymakers who created it. When aluminum-dependent plants shut down or relocated, it wasn't just the direct employees who suffered. It was the suppliers, the service providers, the communities that had built their economic foundations around industrial employment. These ripple effects spread through thousands of communities that had no voice in tariff decisions but paid their costs. From a global competitiveness perspective, the aluminum crisis damaged American manufacturing in ways that will take years to repair. When American companies become known for unreliable delivery schedules because they can't get materials, when American products become more expensive because of artificial input cost inflation, when American facilities shut down because policy makes operation impossible, international customers don't wait for problems to be resolved. They find alternative suppliers. The irony reached its perfect expression when American companies began permanently relocating aluminum-intensive operations to Canada and other countries not to access cheaper labor or lower taxes, but simply to access aluminum. The tariffs designed to bring manufacturing back to America instead drove it away faster than any foreign competitor ever could have managed. Canadian manufacturing experienced unprecedented growth during this period, not because Canadian companies became more innovative or efficient overnight, but because they could get aluminum. That basic ability to access raw materials became a decisive competitive advantage that Canadian officials leveraged into broader industrial development strategies. The long-term consequences of this policy disaster are still unfolding, but they're already visible in investment patterns, employment statistics, and industrial capacity. American aluminum-consuming industries contracted significantly, not because of foreign competition, but because American policy made domestic operation more difficult than foreign alternatives. The protection intended to strengthen American industry instead weakened it so severely that recovery may take decades. What's especially maddening about the aluminum crisis is that it demonstrated everything that's wrong with making trade policy through political theater rather than economic analysis. The policy was designed to sound tough and protective without any serious consideration of how it would actually function in practice. When tough-sounding policies produce devastating results, the devastation falls on people who had no role in creating the policy but must live with its consequences. The aluminum apocalypse offers a perfect case study in how protectionism can become self-destruction when it's designed by people who don't understand what they're trying to protect. The goal was to help American aluminum-consuming industries. The result was to cripple them. The intention was to reduce dependence on foreign supplies. The outcome was to make that dependence absolute and desperate. As the crisis continues to reshape American industrial capacity, what becomes clear is that economic policy has consequences that extend far beyond political messaging. When you make it impossible for companies to get the materials they need, they don't thank you for protection. They find alternatives. And once those alternatives become established, reversing the damage requires not just policy changes, but industrial reconstruction that may never fully restore what was lost. For observers trying to understand how economic policy can undermine its own stated objectives, the aluminum crisis provides a textbook example of how ignorance compounds into catastrophe. When policymakers don't understand the systems they're trying to regulate, when political theater takes precedence over economic reality, when protection becomes indistinguishable from sabotage, the results speak for themselves. And in this case, they speak with the voice of shuttered factories, unemployed workers, and an industrial base weakened by the very policies that promise to strengthen it.